Welcome to the Tons of Industry Show. In the past 2 weeks, Wealth Research Group has interviewed key figures and published important interviews with Dr. Ron Paul about the real monster's head, with a 4th of July special about America and how the U.S. has lost its way. Influential blogger and journalist James Corbett of the Corbett Report was on to speak about the New World Order, Deep State, and the Rockefeller connection. Harry Dent was on to talk about his latest forecasts. Carl Denninger on the healthcare unfunded liabilities and the endgame. Marin Katusa with a gold stocks update, and the legendary Jim Rogers and Gerald Salente were on as well, so do check that out. Today, we welcome for the first time HARLEY SCHLANGER, a 30-year veteran, I hope I'm saying this right, a 30-year veteran of the alternative media industry. And in this interview, we're going to focus on global political events, because geopolitics and finance are interconnected in today's world, and I'm thrilled to speak with HARLEY today. So glad to be speaking with you, sir. How are you?
Fine, Lior. I'm very happy to accept your invitation.
Hey, could you please share with us your latest observations of President Trump, his policies, both domestic and abroad, and how the mainstream media covers him, in your opinion?
Well, it's a complex question, but I'll start with the latter part on the media. From the minute of his election, there has been an effort to prevent him from pursuing the policies he campaigned on. You know, during his campaign, he emphasized he was going to end regime change wars. He was going to work with Russia and possibly with China on fighting terrorism, on coordinating policy, and also on finances, economics. At the same time, he made some promises which he has not yet fulfilled, but which he probably could be pushed to do, and that includes Glass-Steagall for banking separation, a move to a credit policy to fund infrastructure. But I think these are the essential themes of his campaign, which scared the hell out of what we generally call now the deep state. But when I talk about the deep state, I mean the financial operatives of the transatlantic world, largely City of London, Brussels, the European Central Bank, and Wall Street and the Federal Reserve, and their interconnections through interlocking boards of directors, corporations, and so on with the intelligence community. And they got together and decided they were going to do whatever they had to do to stop Trump. And we've seen that with the whole Russiagate story. We've seen that with the efforts to implant in his administration people like Mnuchin and Gary Cohn from Goldman Sachs, neocons like McMaster. And what we do see at the same time is that Trump is sticking to one aspect of what he said he was going to do, in particular, which is work with Russia. And that was targeted by the deep state, and that's almost all the media focuses on. So what I've tried to do, and what my associates at Executive Intelligence Review and other groups I work with are doing, is trying to get the actual story out there of why he's under attack. Because there's no evidence of any Russian intervention or Trump collusion with the Russians. But there is evidence that he's trying to overturn the geopolitical doctrine of the last two presidents, of Bush and Obama. And that's what they're trying to protect, that bad agenda, the failed agenda, I would add, of Bush and Obama. So in a sort of summary way, that's how I would say I look at the Trump administration at this point, with a number of things I'm not happy about, but a number of things which I am happy about, in particular, that we have a president who is standing up against the deep state on crucial matters.
Now, let's talk about China and the one road, one bill policy. What should be the U.S. agenda on this matter?
We just had a conference in outside of Frankfurt where we had representatives from top officials from Russia, from China, from Africa, from Europe, and from the United States to discuss this. The Belt and Road Initiative is emerging as an alternative to the failed economic policies, the speculative policies of the West. And this is the fighting issue. This is the underlying issue in the anti-Trump operation, because Trump everyone's focusing on the potential trade war with China, which seems to have erupted today. But go a step deeper. The negotiations with Kim Jong-un and Trump would never have happened except for coordination between China, Japan, South Korea, and Russia with the United States. You never hear about this. You hear Trump is a lone wolf. He's going off on his own. It wouldn't have happened without his good relationship with Xi Jinping, the emerging friendship with Prime Minister Abe of Japan, President Moon of South Korea, and Putin. And what was underlying this? The Belt and Road Initiative. That Trump could say to the North Koreans, if you give up your nuclear weapons strategy, we'll help you through connections with the Belt and Road Initiative so that South Korea going through North Korea, China going through North Korea, can connect with markets in Europe with high-speed rail lines and other channels. So this is an urgent strategic matter. Now, the second area of importance for the Belt and Road in Europe, and I'm talking to you from Berlin, is the refugee question. And the European Union is tied in knots over this because they have no solution. It's not a solution to put people in camps in Africa. It's not a solution to close borders, but there is a solution. And this is coming now from the Italian government, the new Italian government, from the Austrian government, which is to work with China in Africa to invest in infrastructure. And so to me, the Belt and Road Initiative represents a shift back to what we used to call the American system of economics. You invest in physical production, not financial innovation and funny money schemes like derivatives and swaps and all the craziness we've seen in the last 20 to 30 years. You put your investments into something physical so that the debt that you're creating through new credit can be covered in the future by increases in productivity, new technologies, and so on. There's no way to cover the existing outstanding corporate and personal and government debt by borrowing more money. It's a crazy strategy.
Now, what's truly rallying markets right now is Europe, as you say, their immigrant crisis and their debt implosion. You're right now in Germany. Please share with us in detail how you view this continent and its woes with what's going on right now. It's obviously not only Germany, but it's a big political problem everywhere. France, Italy, Southern Europe. I've traveled to, I'd say, most of the major European countries in the past 3 years. I've been to Spain, Italy, Greece, Croatia, Germany, Switzerland, Austria. They all have quite the problem ahead of them with regards to how they re-engineer their societies. So, and obviously, we're talking about countries that have a very, very unique age pyramid with many retirees, very low productivity for new children. So they have 1 to 2 children. They marry late. It's a big social system based on an ever declining working class. And just your thoughts on all of this.
The main problem in Europe was that the euro was never designed as a production currency. It was an attempt to create a false unity around a monetary solution. And so this was largely done for the benefit of the German banks, the British banks, policed through the European Central Bank. Like Greece, for example, you mentioned Spain, Italy, Greece. The problem was that in order to bring them into the euro, they generated huge amounts of new debt and then made governments responsible for paying that debt without giving them the means to invest in their own economies. And as the problems emerged in the last few years, increasingly, what they said is the solution is austerity for those countries, more credit, which is channeled through their banking system, but going to the creditor banks, namely the German, the British banks, Santander, and so on, and nothing for the physical production that's the source of real wealth. And so you had a debt scheme largely imposed on Europe, on poorer countries, and there's a rebellion against it. It started with Brexit. I would say that Brexit, the Italian vote, the Austrian vote, even the German vote, are in line with the vote of Trump, an anti-establishment insurgency based on a sense that the elites have no idea of the suffering of the majority of the population under these monetary policies. And so we saw in Greece, for example, policies that were leading to increases in suicides, people losing their homes, homes that had been in families for hundreds of years. In Italy, we saw bail-ins. The new European Central Bank policy is that which we saw in Cyprus a few years ago. The banks can steal the deposits of their clients in order to pay off the debt. And then, of course, the European Central Bank followed the model of the Federal Reserve and just pumped huge amounts of liquidity into the banks, buying a lot of their bad debt off the books, but nowhere near the total volume of bad debt. So you take a bank like Deutsche Bank. This is a huge problem for Germany because its leading bank has had its stock fall below 10 euros a share. It's sitting there holding $43 trillion in derivative obligations. It is not going to get paid back by Greece and Italy unless the European Central Bank fronts them the money. So there's no solutions from the old regime. And as a result, voters are turning to parties like the Lega in Italy. We saw someone come out of nowhere, Macron, who's, in my view, a representative of the banks, but he was outside of the main party structures. In Germany, the two leading parties that were the coalition partners suffered their lowest vote total since World War II in terms of percentages. And you have the emergence of groups like the AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland, which doesn't really have solutions. So in Europe, you have this false hype about a recovery. But you mentioned something earlier about productivity. Germany is suffering decline in productivity in its industry for the first time since the economic miracle in the 50s and 60s. So this is a terrible sign for Europe. And the other question, the demographics, the population curve is upside down. I actually live in Potsdam, which is in the former East Germany, and you see very few children. So many of the people are aging. They're pensioners. They don't have an industrial workforce. They were getting it from Poland and from countries like that, but now that those countries are starting to emerge, they don't have a workforce. And I think Merkel thought maybe the solution would be bringing in Syrian refugees, Iraqi, Afghan refugees, but it's not going to work. So Europe is in a perpetual crisis, and you have new governments emerging, like the Austrian and Italian governments, which are run by Eurosceptics. So there's a legitimate fear that Europe is imploding. And I would say from seeing it from the inside, that's certainly happening.
Now, Harley, you released an article about the connection between Hamilton, Lincoln, and Kennedy. What did your research unveil there?
Well, there's a lot of lying about Hamilton and Lincoln as big bankers or people who had the British model in mind. Hamilton was the aide to George Washington. The idea that he was a British agent. He was killed by Aaron Burr, who fled the United States to Great Britain. So the idea that he was a British banking agent is just wrong. Hamilton established something called a national credit policy. His national bank was not a Federal Reserve Bank. It was the credit policy was determined by the U.S. Congress, that is supposedly the people's representatives. And what Hamilton did was use credit to invest in infrastructure and then in what he called useful manufactures. And that's what enabled the United States to develop an economy and pay off its debt. Lincoln's greenback policy, similarly, was not a big banker policy. It was a government-funded dirigist or government-directed credit into the private sector, but into areas of emerging technologies, in that case, rail, steel, and so on. And Kennedy was moving in the same direction. Kennedy, in June of 1963, ordered an issuing of treasury bills, or treasury notes rather, outside of the Federal Reserve. And he was doing it because the Fed was restricting credit at a point at which Kennedy realized we needed reinvestment to update and modernize our major industries. And instead, after Kennedy's assassination, we had a breakup of the fixed exchange rate system, the Bretton Woods system, and a move into increasingly speculative investment policies. So I think the lesson here is that this idea of the American system, of investing, of government credit being directed, not controlled entirely, but directed through the private banking system into those areas of physical production which will produce enough wealth to pay off the debt incurred. That's what China is doing now. And so this Hamiltonian system is the idea of, for example, the United States setting up an infrastructure bank, which could be largely funded by the government as a capital budget type approach, which would make credit available to those companies that will build new infrastructure. And I think that would go a long way towards reindustrializing the United States.
Now, you talk a lot about the globalist system falling apart, the deep state running out of gas. What's the latest on that front?
Well, the Mueller investigation has done nothing except disrupt the potential of the elected president to conduct foreign policy. It's paralyzed the Congress. It's increased partisan divide in this country. And for what? A phony story that was largely created in Great Britain in the GCHQ, the British component of the National Security Agency. The MI6 networks, including Christopher Steele with his famous dossier, came to John Brennan, and Brennan and Clapper, the director of national intelligence under Obama, got Comey to set up a Get Trump task force, which we've been hearing a lot about through the Inspector General's report, FBI agents like Peter Strzok, the corruption of Comey, and so on. But the real story here is that this corruption had a purpose, which was to constrain Trump from pursuing what he said he was going to do. And so where does it stand right now? Well, I think Trump has felt somewhat liberated by the fact that there's no evidence that's been presented after almost 2 years. It was in June of 2016 that the original FBI, or July 2016, the original FBI Get Trump task force was set up. So in the 2 years they've been there, they've produced nothing except more evidence of corruption of these deep state networks. Secondly, he feels somewhat liberated by the success of the meeting with Kim Jong-un. Now, by success, I don't mean that North Korea is denuclearized overnight, but that there was a coalition that came together with a strategy that said to North Korea, we will take care of you. We will help you develop if you adhere to our demands that you shut down your nuclear program. So it wasn't just the United States making a threat. It was a group of nations that came together. And that, again, goes back to the Silk Road. So I think where we stand is that the deep state has been completely exposed, maybe not so much in the U.S. media, but in the alternative media, exposed as running an illegal, corrupt attack on the election of a president. And whether you want to argue about popular vote or electoral college, that's our system. He was elected by the system. And instead of accepting that, they're trying to overturn it in a kind of regime change operation that we've seen in Ukraine, or we're seeing now in Venezuela. We saw what they did in Iraq, where they used the military to carry out regime change. But it's the same thing, the same principle and the same people doing it, and for the same reason, to protect a bankrupt, collapsing system of U.S. unilateralism and geopolitics.
It's just interesting to see how no U.S. president for decades has said, you know what, let's just talk with the North Koreans. Let's just see what's going on. And this president just does what is necessary and not what looks good. Harley, do you foresee any looming problems for the U.S. economy? There's imminent problems and there are immediate problems. Do you see any of the two, and what supports this? Because I've been in the U.S. now for 3 months, major cities, inner belt, heartland, and it's booming. It's booming. Real estate's booming. Airports are packed. Hotels are packed. Main Street looks good. The occupancy levels of commercial buildings look good. Obviously, retail is suffering tremendously, but it suffers while online retail thrives. So it's a very changing economy. Doesn't look at all like what happened when I was here 2011 and 2012 when there was a lot of fear going around. Is this a official recovery, or are we headed for a surprise here?
I would say it's a debt-driven spike upward. The tax reform added to it, because what's the basic source of the increase in income? It's stocks. It's speculation. It's a stock bubble. There's a debt crisis. Major corporations whose stocks are booming are holding large amounts of worthless debt. They're borrowing money to buy their own stock to lift up its price. They're using the tax reform money to buy their own stock. The underlying reality is that there's more debt today and higher leverage rates today than there was in 2008. And so, the things that people point toward that you mentioned, the real estate is seemingly better, the stock market is booming, all of that was going on in 2008. You have to look at the underlying question of what is supporting this and what happens when the interest rates start going up and corporations can no longer borrow, or it costs much more to borrow to refinance debt. I would say the unsustainable levels of corporate debt, personal debt, and government debt are going to cause a profound shock at some point in the near future. Now, the other problem, of course, is what looks like a trade war developing. I think that this was initially a negotiating tactic by Trump that was taken to an extreme by people like Lighthouser, his trade representative, and Navarro, and they're having a hard time figuring out how to get out of it. That could have some problems, but I think the deeper problem is this pile up of debt. And by that, I just mean unsustainable levels. The corporations are not going to be able to turn over the debt, especially if they don't have a channel of money pouring into them, liquidity coming from the Fed or the European Central Bank. So that's essentially how I see it.
Harley, any parting thoughts to leave with our viewers? And also, please make sure to tell people how they can access more of your work. Which website are you on, Twitter and everything like that?
Well, I want to thank you for the opportunity to speak to your listeners. I think I would simply say that there are solutions, that change is occurring around the world. There's a shift occurring toward physical production, physical economy, not just around China, but there's a great deal of interest in Europe in moving out of this debt-driven bubble economy. Trump appealed to the Americans on this in his campaign. He hasn't done it yet, but I think there's still a potential here for the United States to move. And so while we look at the insanity coming from the mainstream media and the deep state, you have to realize that they're doing this in a hysterical way because of their fears. Their fears that a new system is potentially there. And I'm not talking about a system controlled by the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers, because China is not controlled by the Western banking system. That's the whole reason that they're demanding that China open up their banking system to become part of the Western system. And the Chinese have said no. They've instead said to the United States, why don't you join us in investing in real economy? So there is a potential for a change, People can follow this by going to the main website that I'm involved with, which is larouchepack.com. But if people would like to be in touch with me or like to get copies of articles by me or get hooked into my blog, you can send an email to me directly, and I will respond. So my email address is harleysch@gmail.com. And as I said, I will respond and get you the most recent article that I've written.
Harley, thank you very much for taking the time here.
Well, thank you.